Wyoming Territory, late spring of 1883, the wind cut sharp across the plains outside Casper as the stagecoach door slammed shut behind her. Lettie Rae stood alone in the dust, fingers wrapped tight around the handle of her carpetbag. Her boots sank half an inch into the road's soft edge, her heart sinking twice as deep. The driver barely looked at her before climbing back up and flicking the reins. The stage rattled off, trailing grit and shame behind it. He had sent her back. The man who had written her letters, 3 of them, neatly penned, all full of promises and hopes, had taken one look at her when she stepped down from the coach 2 days ago and said, "You are older than I expected." And that was it. 35. That is what she was. Not old, not young, just enough to be returned like a parcel gone wrong. She had not cried when he told her. She had not argued. She had simply nodded, turned, and climbed back onto the coach when it headed east again. But now, back in Casper with no money and no plan, the tightness in her throat would not let go. The station agent came out from the depot, squinting beneath his wide hat. "Ma'am, you waiting for someone?" "No," she said, voice steady. "Just got off." He scratched his chin. "Well, if you need somewhere to rest your head, there's a boarding house up the road. Miss Grady runs it." "Thank you," Lettie said, and started walking. She had made it halfway to the boarding house when a voice called out behind her. "Ma'am," she turned, blinking against the sun. A tall man stood near the water trough outside the livery. He wore a worn duster, dust on his boots, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled just low enough to shade his eyes. His beard was more silver than black. His shoulders were broad. His voice was deep but not unkind. "I saw you get off the coach," he said, stepping closer. "You headed somewhere?" "Not anymore," Lettie answered. He looked at her a long moment. "You the mail-order bride from Kansas?" Her spine straightened. "I was." He took a breath, then nodded once like something had settled in his mind. "Then you'll understand me," she blinked. "Excuse me? I sent for a bride once. Years ago, she never came, and I never sent for another. Figured I was too old, too broke, too much of a quiet man for anyone to want. But when I saw you standing there, left behind like something unwanted, I figured maybe you'd understand that too." Lettie stared at him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," he said, stepping closer, "you can come stay at my place for a while. I've got a clean cabin, a spare bed, and 2 kids who could use a woman's steadier hand. I won't ask nothing of you, not unless you want to give it, but you will not be left out here alone." Lettie looked up at him, her throat tight again, but not from shame this time. "What is your name?" she asked. "Barrett Holt," he said. "I run cattle out near the South Fork. 43 years old, widowed 5 years. My son and daughter are with my neighbor till I get back." She hesitated. "I know what it feels like," he said quietly, "to be passed over, counted out. I saw your face when you got off that coach. Same look I had when I buried my wife and thought no one would look my way again." She swallowed hard. "I am not helpless." "I never said you were," he said, "but I reckon you deserve better than being turned back like spoiled goods." She looked down at her bag, then up at him again. "2 children? Ben is 10. Clara is 8. Lettie gave a small nod. "I will come just for a few days." Barrett tipped his hat. "That is all I ask." They rode out just before dusk. His wagon was plain but sturdy, the horses sure-footed. Lettie sat beside him in silence for the first mile, her bag tucked at her feet. The wind had eased. The sky stretched wide over them, gold melting into soft blue. He glanced at her. "You ever been west of Kansas?" "No," she said. "My whole life till now was in Topeka." "Why did you answer that ad?" he asked, not unkindly. She looked out at the horizon, the way the light touched the hills. "My parents passed. I had no siblings, no job after the sewing shop closed. I had nothing but time and a name no one remembered." She paused. "I figured I could be of use to someone." Barrett nodded. "Well, you are." They reached the cabin just after nightfall. It was small but strong, with a porch and a barn and a garden plot edged with stones. Chickens rustled in the coop, and a dog barked once and then stopped when he saw Barrett. Inside, it smelled of pine and leather and something warm like cinnamon. Barrett lit a lantern, then motioned to the back room. That is yours if you want it. She stepped inside. The bed was made. A small dresser stood against the wall. A quilt lay folded at the foot of the mattress. Lettie turned to look at him. You are not expecting company. No, he said softly, but I always keep it ready, just in case. She blinked fast. You should get some rest. I will, Barrett said. You sleep well, Lettie? When the door shut behind him, she sat on the edge of the bed and let her hand rest on the quilt. It was worn but clean. The stitches were neat. She ran her fingers along them, feeling something she had not felt in years, safe. The next morning, she woke to the sound of laughter. She stepped outside to find two children tumbling out of a wagon with armfuls of wildflowers. Barrett stood nearby, arms crossed, watching them with a half smile. The boy Ben looked up at her first. Are you the new lady? Lettie blinked. I suppose I might be. The girl Clara came closer. We brought flowers. Papa said you like pretty things. Lettie knelt down and took the bunch from her. These are beautiful, Clara beamed. I like your dress. You look like a teacher. Lettie laughed, surprised by the sound of it. I used to be. Barrett stepped up beside her. Clara and Ben, this is Miss Lettie Rae. Hi, Miss Lettie, Ben said, wiping his hands on his trousers. She stood slowly, her eyes meeting Barrett's. I hope you will not mind if I stay a little longer than a few days. He held her gaze. I was hoping you might. And for the first time in years, Lettie Rae smiled without effort. The ground had dried firm by the time Barrett hitched the wagon for town. Lettie stood by the porch, sleeves rolled and apron dusted with flour, watching as Ben practiced roping a fence post with a loop he'd tied himself. Clara sat cross-legged beneath the cottonwood, her doll propped between two stones like it was listening to her whisper a story. Barrett adjusted the reins, then glanced toward the porch. Need anything from Miller's? Lettie brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. Salt and thread if they still carry the finer kind, white or pale blue. He nodded, then stepped into the wagon. I'll be back before supper. Ben ran to the edge of the yard. Can I come next time? Barrett tipped his hat back slightly. Next time, sure, but today I need to move quick. He set off down the track, the wagon creaking in rhythm with the horse's steady pace. Lettie turned back to the house, wiping her hands before heading inside. By midday, the kitchen held the scent of stewed beans and wild onions. Lettie kept her hands busy shaping dough, her gaze lifting now and then to the window where Clara still played quietly. The girl had taken to her without hesitation, asking questions and offering small gifts, a pine cone, a feather, a stone shaped like a heart. Ben was slower in his trust, but he listened closely when Lettie read aloud after supper, and he'd begun asking her questions about places she'd lived. The sun had begun its slow descent when Clara appeared in the doorway, cheeks pink from the breeze. Miss Lettie, Papa's been gone a long time. Lettie dried her hands. He has, but he said he'd be back before supper and your father keeps his word. Clara leaned against the frame. Do you know how to make dolls out of corn husks? I do. Will you show me? Lettie smiled gently. Tomorrow morning, we'll need water to soften the husks first. Clara nodded, satisfied, and wandered back outside. That evening, Barrett returned with the wagon bed half full. Sacks of flour and salt, a spool of blue thread, and a parcel wrapped in brown paper. He handed the package to Lettie without a word. Inside was a bar of lavender soap and a small tin of beeswax polish. She looked up at him, uncertain. What's this for? You make this place steadier, he said. Figured you ought to have something your own. The words sat between them, quiet but solid. She tucked the items away without replying, but her touch lingered on the tin a breath longer than necessary. After supper, when the children were tucked under quilts, Barrett brought 2 mugs of chicory to the porch. Lettie accepted hers, wrapping her hands around the warmth. He leaned back against the railing, watching the horizon darken. You always plan on staying in Kansas? He asked. For a long time, yes, she said. My parents needed me, then I blinked and I was 35 and the town was smaller than it used to be, everything familiar but nothing left for me. He nodded slowly. I know that feeling. She looked at him, not searching, just listening. I took over this land when I was 22, he continued. Built the cabin with my own hands, thought I'd spend my life with one woman, maybe get old together, watch the kids grow. What happened? He took a sip from the mug. Fever hit the valley, took her fast. I buried her beneath the cottonwoods. Lettie didn't speak. The quiet between them was not heavy, just wide enough to hold what could not be fixed. Barrett set his mug down. I don't expect anything from you, Lettie. I want you to know that. I believe you, she said. But I also won't lie, I'm glad you're here. She turned to face him, the last light of day soft on her features. I'm glad, too. He didn't move closer, didn't reach for her. He just stayed there, as sure and steady as the land around them. Later, when the lanterns were out and the house had gone still, Lettie lay in her bed with the scent of lavender rising from her skin. Somewhere across the hall, Barrett's boots had long since gone quiet. A night wind stirred the curtains, and she felt, for the first time in years, that she wasn't waiting for her life to begin. It had already started, quietly, without permission, and she was still in it. A late frost touched the tips of the sagebrush the following morning, thin white dust clinging to the undersides of leaves where the sun hadn't yet reached. Lettie stepped outside with a bucket in one hand and a shawl wrapped snug around her shoulders, her breath visible in the air. The pump handle felt cold through her glove as she began drawing water for the morning's wash. Behind her, the cabin door creaked open. You always rise this early? Barrett asked, his voice still rough with sleep. Habit, she said, glancing back at him. Kansas mornings started before light if you meant to finish your chores before the heat came. He rubbed his shoulder absently. My mother used to say the same. She poured water into the basin, careful not to splash him. Did she live nearby? No, he said. She and my father were from Missouri, came west when I was small. We lost her during a hard winter near Sweetwater. He stepped down from the porch, the boards groaning faintly under his weight. I still hear her voice when I split kindling too slow. Lettie smiled faintly. My father had a way of clearing his throat whenever I got too sharp with my tongue. I still check myself when I hear someone do it. Barrett lifted the second bucket without being asked and carried it inside. Later that morning, Lettie laid the softened husks on the table beside Clara, who watched with quiet focus as the doll began to take shape under Lettie's hands. Ben returned from the meadow with his boots wet and his cheeks red, a bundle of kindling balanced under one arm. Papa said the creek's still running fast, he said. I saw a fox on the ridge. Lettie looked up from the doll's tiny arms. Did he see you? He stopped and looked right at me. Didn't run. Ben's eyes were bright. Is that good luck? Some folks say it is, she answered. But I think it just means you stood still long enough to be trusted. Clara turned the doll over in her hands. Can I give her a name? Of course. I'll call her Fern. Barrett came in through the back with a wrapped cloth in his hand. Kip brought smoked trout down from his line. Traded for one of our seed sacks. He set it on the table and unwrapped it. Lettie reached for the knife and began slicing it into even portions. Barrett leaned against the frame of the open door. We'll need more hands for the branding later this month. I was thinking to ask the Thompsons. Lettie glanced up. Will they bring their boys? Likely. I can keep Clara and Ben occupied here. They don't need to be around the pens for that. He nodded once. I'd be grateful. That night, Barrett sat beside the fire after the children had gone to bed, turning a worn horseshoe in his hands. Lettie took a seat near the hearth, mending a seam in one of Ben's shirts. Your stitching's straight, he said. Better than my handwriting, she replied. He was quiet a moment, running his thumb along the rusted edge of the horseshoe. I didn't expect this to feel easy. She didn't look up. Does it? He nodded slowly. More than I'd admit out loud. She tied off the thread. I think we both learned not to expect much kindness. He looked at her then, the firelight catching the lines near his eyes. You've brought more than kindness into this house. Lettie folded the shirt, smoothing it once before setting it aside. I didn't come here to be saved. I know, he said. You came because someone else couldn't see you proper. She met his gaze, steady now. And what do you see? Barrett set the horseshoe down and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. A woman who's braver than most men I've known, strong-backed. Clear-eyed, someone who didn't let shame turn her bitter. Lettie's throat tightened, but she didn't look away. "You're not what I expected either," he raised a brow. "No, you listen more than you speak. You don't make promises you can't keep. And you don't treat me like I'm temporary." Barrett's voice dropped low. "You're not." She felt the air shift then, not with urgency, but with something rooted and certain. The kind of silence that came after a fence was mended or a harvest brought in. He stood. "I'll be up early. The fence line needs walking. I'll pack you something to take." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Good night, Lettie." "Good night, Barrett." When the door to his room clicked shut, she sat still by the fire, her hands quiet in her lap. The warmth on her cheeks wasn't from the flames. Upstairs, the wind brushed against the cabin walls, but it didn't sound lonely. It just sounded like weather passing through a place built to last. Lettie stood in the barn doorway, brushing sawdust from her skirt, watching as Barrett led one of the young heifers into the smaller pen. The animal was skittish from the morning's cold, but he moved slow and easy, his voice low, guiding her with a steadiness that reminded Lettie of the way he handled his children, never rushed, never hard. He glanced toward her once the gate latched. "She's ready for weaning." "Clara named her Maple last week." Lettie folded her arms, leaning against the frame. "That suits her. She's stubborn." Barrett chuckled under his breath, brushing his gloves clean. Clara said the same. The wind carried the scent of thawing earth and damp wood. Lettie's hands itched for planting, but the nights were still too sharp for seed. She'd planned the rows in her head, though beets near the fence line, beans running up twine beside the porch. Barrett hadn't asked her to stay past spring, but he also hadn't spoken of her leaving. He met her gaze. "You ever learned to ride?" She blinked. "Not properly, only side saddle, and never more than a few miles at a time." "If you want to learn, I can show you." Her brow lifted slightly. "You're offering to teach me on one of those mountain-bred beasts out there. They're gentler than they look." She hesitated, then nodded. "All right. But if I break something, you'll have to make your own biscuits." Later, under a pale blue sky, Lettie stood beside a bay gelding named Flint, her gloved hands wrapped around the saddle horn as Barrett adjusted the stirrup length. The animal shifted once, ears twitching, but held still. "Step up slow and lean forward," Barrett said, his hand light at her elbow. "He won't spook." She climbed into the saddle, adjusting her skirt enough to settle properly. The leather creaked beneath her and her pulse quickened. Barrett stepped back. "You all right? I'm not afraid," she said. "Just aware of every bone I've got," he grinned, but didn't tease her. "Let him walk, don't pull the reins unless you mean it." She nudged the gelding forward. The horse obeyed, slow and deliberate. She rode the edge of the pasture, Barrett walking alongside, correcting her posture now and then with a quiet word. By the time she circled back, her spine ached, but her face was flushed with the thrill of it. Barrett reached up to steady her as she dismounted. "You rode clean." "I didn't fall. That's what clean means." She handed him the reins with a small nod. "I'd like to try again tomorrow." He met her eyes. "You'd be welcome to." That evening, Lettie brought out a tin she'd found buried in the back of the pantry, a few blackcurrant preserves sealed with wax. She spread them thin across warm cornbread, setting a piece beside each plate. The children took their first bites and went quiet with surprise. Clara looked up. "Where'd this come from?" Lettie wiped her hands on her apron. "Your mother put it up. I found it this morning." Ben chewed slowly, then said, "She was good at saving things." Barrett's voice was quiet. "She was." Lettie sat down, folding her napkin in her lap. "She left you a well-kept home." "She did," Barrett said, "and I reckon she'd be glad to see someone tending it again." After supper, Barrett lingered outside while Lettie cleaned the table. The last of the sun clung to the tops of the hills, gold fading to rose. When she stepped onto the porch, he was sharpening a blade against a whetstone, his movements steady. She sat beside him, her hands folded. He didn't look over. "You thinking about Kansas?" "No," she said. "I was thinking about your wife. What she must have been like." He paused, then set the knife down. She was quiet until she wasn't, grew up near Elk Mountain, strong hands and a soft voice. "Do you miss her?" "Every day," he said, "but it's not just grief anymore, it's memory. It don't ache the same way." Lettie nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me." He turned to her then, eyes steady. "I'm not trying to replace her. I don't expect you to fill anything that belonged to her." "You're not asking me to," she said. The silence that followed was easy, not empty. Barrett leaned back, arms resting on his knees. "You've changed the feel of this house." She watched the shadows stretch across the yard. "I didn't mean to, I know," he said. "That's why it matters." She stood after a while, her fingers brushing his shoulder as she passed. "Good night, Barrett." His voice followed her softly. "Sleep warm, Lettie." And she did. By the time the first wild plum blossoms opened along the creek, Lettie had taught Clara how to hem a dress sleeve and Ben how to write his name in a straight line. The cabin had grown quieter in the evenings, not from silence, but from peace. There were fewer questions now, fewer hesitations. The rhythm of days had settled into something shared. Barrett came in late one afternoon with dust on his sleeves and a folded paper in his hand. He set it on the kitchen table without a word and poured himself a cup of water from the tin pitcher. Lettie eyed him, setting aside the basket of mended socks. "What is it?" He took a long drink before answering. "Land surveyor passed through, said the railroad's still pushing west. They're laying tracks near Rawlins less than 100 miles from here." She glanced at the paper. "Is that good for you?" "Could be," he said. "More cattle buyers, easier shipping, but it'll bring strangers through, folks looking to buy up land cheap or pass through without care." Lettie reached for the paper but didn't unfold it. "You worried?" "Not yet." He leaned back against the counter watching her. "But it means change, and I figure if it's coming, best to know where I stand." She brushed a bit of lint from her sleeve. "You stand steady," his voice lowered. "I try." That night, as the fire burned low, Barrett lingered on the porch long after the children had gone to sleep. Lettie stepped out, a shawl over her shoulders, her hands folded. "I've been thinking," she said. He didn't turn. "About leaving?" "No," she said. "About staying." Now he looked at her. "You'd stay?" She nodded once. "If there's a place for me." "There is," he said, "but only if you want it." "I do." He took a step closer, slow, like he didn't want to misstep. "This wasn't what either of us planned." "No," she said. "But it's better." He reached for her hand, calloused fingers brushing hers. "I never thought I'd say this again, but I want a life with you, Lettie, not just a roof we share. A life." Her voice was steady. "So do I." He kissed her then, soft and sure, the kind of kiss that came not from sudden want but from days spent earning it. When they parted, she stayed close, her forehead resting lightly against his chest. "I'll tell the children in the morning," he said. "I'd like that." They married 2 weeks later, beneath the cottonwood trees where his first wife lay buried. Lettie laid a sprig of lavender on the grave before the ceremony, her fingers lingering on the bark of the tree beside it. Clara wore a ribbon in her hair. Ben stood tall in his best shirt, his hand in his father's. Barrett wore his wedding coat, brushed clean, and Lettie wore a dress she'd finished herself, light blue with a row of buttons down the front and a hem that just cleared her boots. The neighbor's wife, Mrs. Talbot, brought a jar of honey as a gift. "For the sweet days ahead," she said, pressing it into Lettie's hands. Afterward, they ate stew in the yard and passed around cornbread and preserved peaches. The sun stayed high that day, as if the sky had been asked to hold it just a little longer. That summer, Barrett built a new room off the east side of the cabin. Lettie filled it with shelves and books and taught the children to read by the light of the afternoon sun. Clara learned to sew straight seams, and Ben learned to ride without looking back over his shoulder. Lettie planted beans that climbed all the way to the porch rail, and Barrett carved her a bench beneath the trees, where she liked to sit with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the hills. They didn't speak often of how things had begun, of letters unanswered, or stagecoaches turned around, but the life they built was steady, and the love between them needed no proving. On quiet evenings, he would reach for her hand as they watched the children chase fireflies across the yard, and she would lean into his side, the warmth of him enough to remind her of all she had found. And though the railroad came and strangers passed through, the land remained theirs. The cabin stood, the garden grew, and in the hush between days there remained the sure and simple truth that they had chosen one another freely, finally, and for good. Years later, when Clara was grown and Ben had taken over part of the herd, Barrett still rose early and Lettie still made biscuits by hand. Theirs was not a loud life nor a grand one, but it was whole, and it was their own.